So I wanted to respond to Blue Sky Toxic Energy's comment because I think it's a really good point. This commenter wants to know why Carrie Nation wouldn't just rally against abusive men in general and instead take up arms against alcohol. This is an excellent question, and I want to try and unpack that. So let's get into it. So I think this is a really tricky thing to unpack because I think it's pretty complicated, but one of the things that I've noticed about patriarchy as I'm unpacking it for myself is the way that the difficulty that exists in just enlisting men's help in dismantling patriarchy. And the reality is, in a democracy, as half of the population, we can only sometimes affect change if it's just women. You have to enlist men's help. And in the time period that Carrie Nation was doing her work, women didn't have the vote. And so they needed men's cooperation in order to do anything. And for me, I feel like temperance was a way to take the focus off of patriarchy, off of the corruptive systems that were in place that kept men in power and kept women in a position to be victimized. That took the focus off of that and put it on alcohol, which made it more socially acceptable. And I think it also gave men an excuse for their abusive behavior. And this is something that still happens today, where abusive men will be like, oh, I really have a problem with XYZ substance. They'll be like, I'm going to get clean and then everything will be better, when in reality, the problem is abuse, not alcohol. I mean, alcohol doesn't make it better, but the problem is abuse. So essentially, I feel like temperance was a way for men to save face if they were abusive to their families and they wanted to change. This gave them a way to change and save face. And saving face in patriarchy is very important. So think of a scenario where, say, your husband is abusive and alcoholic, and you really want him to change. And maybe he actually wants to change. Maybe he sees that this is damaging to his family. He actually wants to change. He could then say, okay, I'm going to quit alcohol, and then use his quitting alcohol as an excuse to quit all of the bad behavior. And then he can just say, I wasn't abusive, I was under the influence of demon liquor. So it's a way to abdicate responsibility and a way to make it so that men don't have to feel bad about changing. They don't have to actually take accountability because they can just say, I was under the influence of demon alcohol. Now, they may have been under the influence of demon alcohol, and alcohol is very addictive, and it's a really toxic addiction, and it leads to some really dark stuff. But I think that the reason why they didn't just say we need men to stop spending all their money on things other than their wives and children to the point where their wives and children don't have anything to eat. We need men to actually care about their wives and children. We need men to stop treating women as property. We need men to stop physically hurting their wives and children. They weren't going to take that well. So I think focusing on alcohol was a way to get around men's feelings in a time period when women didn't have agency. And the reality is, we still, as a society, as women who are politically active, who want to make changes in our society, we are only 50% of the population, and that's a huge part of the population, but we are only half, and we are not, as we have seen in recent elections, a united front on all of these things. So say 30% of women want to see the patriarchy dismantled. That's not enough. We need men to be on our side, and unfortunately, a lot of men want to reserve at least some of patriarchy's perks for themselves. A lot of men do not want to see patriarchy dismantled because they benefit from it. They are also harmed from it. I don't think the benefits outweigh the drawbacks, but that's just me. And I am affected more negatively by patriarchy than men are. So if you are in a position to vote and you can assume that they're going to vote in their best interest, a lot of men want to reserve some of the benefits of patriarchy. In Carrie Nation's time period, I think men would have wanted to reserve all the property being theirs. They would have wanted to reserve unfettered access to the physical person of their wives. They might have wanted to reserve the ability to harm their wives physically, which was legally available to them as long as it was not excessive. So there were laws on the books, and I'm not saying how strictly these laws were enforced, but there were laws on the books where you could legally harm your spouse, your wife, if you did it with a rod that was no bigger than your thumb. So this is how they controlled excessive force within the marriage. And it was socially unacceptable to physically harm your wife excessively. But what the standards of excessive were what I think we would in the modern world would find pretty appalling. So men may have wanted to reserve these privileges for themselves. And women knew this. They lived with men. They knew that this unfairness was not something that men were going to want to address. And their part of this unfairness, their piece of their own behavior that was contributing to this unfairness and this inequality was not something that men were going to want to address. And so they used this other cause as a front to make some of the reforms that they needed to make. And the women could get some movement towards men behaving better, and men had a front, they had an excuse, they had a way to save face so that they didn't have to take full responsibility for all the harms that they had done. So it was effective in that way, but from a modern standpoint, it makes me mad because I'm just like, you blame it on booze, but it's not booze. It's patriarchy, it's inequality, it's abuse. So yeah, it's a really great question. Thank you for asking it.